We're good. All right. Welcome, everybody. Hopefully you were as informed as I was in understanding the scholarship program. Some very exciting changes and of course, some opportunities for growth and improvement. A lot of course, in looking at budgeting, one of the things that we know for sure is that there is a specific opportunity in impacting our schools because so much of our budget goes towards personnel, right? So what we're talking about today is how to not just hire teachers or not just how to hire employees, but how to build a team, right? And that's the strategic advantage that a lot of the schools that are growing are being very intentional about their talent. I know, Bob, you work with a lot of schools and see that as well in your work because it's, man, if you can build a talented, engaged team, it's a game changer. Right, and that's what we want to talk about today as we've worked with different schools. I'm just going to show you a rubric that was created by a school a few weeks ago over on the left coast as we were working with them so that you can kind of see what that can look like and what schools are doing to be, again, more strategic in what they're doing in their recruiting. So have you ever heard of the rules of 80? You ever heard of that for school leadership, the rules of 80? Good, because I made it up. So the rules of 80 are this: 80% of your budget goes towards, approximately, right? Personnel, right? Goes towards payroll and benefits and the rest, right? We can agree on that. 80% of the student impact that you have is from personnel, right? If you look at the research from TNTP and Harvard and others, 80% of the student growth that occurs is driven by faculty quality and faculty engagement. Faculty quality and engagement is the leading predictor of student growth, right? Very reliable. Next rule of 80 is this: 80% of the stress in your life as an administrator comes from personnel. That's right, personnel, right? Because it does. It just, sometimes in the way that they handle decisions and the way they communicate or lack thereof, right? 80% of your headaches as an administrator, 80% of the reason why you're taking Excedrin or Tums is because of personnel, right? And then finally, marketing energy. The cheapest and most effective marketing strategy that a school has is their personnel. Right? Because talented, energized, engaged faculty, and when we say faculty, we mean every employee of the school because we're all in the teaching business. Sometimes students have as much of a teaching relationship with the receptionist or the janitor as they do the English teacher or the fifth grade teacher, right? So we're all in the teaching business, every employee of the school. Right? So 80, that's the rules of 80. So this idea of personnel, it really matters. And that's why we say we're not just trying to hire teachers, we're trying to build a team, right? Because high-performing teams are the game changers when it comes to school leadership. And that's one of the struggles as we've worked with different school administrators around the country. We hear this feedback from the heads particularly. How do I stay focused on those things when I've got so many other crises to deal with, right? And that's so we spend a lot of time counseling and coaching the heads through how to stay focused on the one thing, right? The one thing that's going to matter the most. You have to hire well and fire well in order to build a remarkable school. And so knowing how to use your time wisely is a part of that process, but you have to put your money and your time where it's going to make the biggest impact, and that is always going to be on people. So one of the things we encourage heads of schools to do is don't delegate the personnel. You have to own the processes and the decisions when it comes to personnel because they will make or break your career, right? As well as the opportunities for your kids. So here's what we're going to talk through today, and that is using an approach that is not just about compliance hiring nor convenience hiring, but as we talked about in our first session last fall, it's catalyst HR, right? We want to be that spark. We want to cause a different way of thinking in our schools, which means that we want to use a mission-driven approach. And I'm going to give you 8 specific steps to use to help change your hiring processes and strategies, right? And so we'll step through those today. And then as you have questions, you're welcome to raise your hand. Otherwise, I will keep going so that we can really get through this material. When you do the math, there's a simple way to improve your hiring accuracy, and that is you have to have more applicants, right? More applicants per position. If you use the right process, you generally will end up hiring a more accurate person if you use some of the processes we're going to share in just a minute. But filling the pool is where it has to start. And there's a lot of great ways that schools are doing this today. And the first thing that they're doing is they're really engaging and interacting with their target market. And when I say that, I mean what schools are recognizing is their first target market isn't their students. That's kind of a scary thought for some school leaders, but your first target market isn't your students. Your first target market is your faculty. If you can build that remarkable team of talent, you'll be able to attract the students. But if you don't, you won't, right? Because if you look at NAIS data, if you look at the Enrollment Management Association, right? What's the number one factor in parents choosing a private school? In every category. Teacher quality, teacher engagement. It's the number one factor, right? So taking the time to really engage and interact with your target market is a very logical thing to allocate and prioritize in your time, right? What can that mean? Oh, here's an example of that. If you know, for example, where your best teachers are coming from, maybe it's the college they're coming from, then take the time to be a guest speaker in that program. Go and visit that school, speak in the master's program or the undergraduate program. Most of those professors we have found are quite interested in having someone come and share about what are some of the realistic expectations of school leaders, of their teachers? What are some of the situations that teachers are going to find themselves in, right? And be able to provide sort of some real stories, right? A lot of the colleges and universities and their departments of education, they're looking for some people like you to come in and share in that way. And we've always found them to be very enthusiastic about welcoming people like you to come in and share some of those stories. So building that engagement, sometimes they're using social media, right? And you're creating some things that would be of interest to teachers in general, but also to begin to share the story about your school. How many of you have materials for marketing to teachers? All right. That's pretty common for schools. We have a lot of materials for recruiting students, but we don't have as much about telling the value proposition and the story for prospective employees. Right? You want to pay attention to that. Your social media group, maybe you want to create a page that's just for people who are in the teaching profession and sharing about the stories of the faculty on your campus and really being able to articulate. This is important. You want to know your value proposition for your teachers, for all of your faculty. Right? Being able to tell that story is important. We've seen people go to job fairs and they look like every other school in the room. There's no differentiation in the story. Faculty don't go into this just because of the facts of your school. They go into it because they have a greater calling, a purpose, right? And so being able to tell your story in a way that connects with them is powerful. And it's a great way to use social media to fill your pool. Another one is investing in interns. A lot of schools, they're looking for a place for their students to go to be able to get some real life experience. So there was a school that was down in Florida who was struggling because, I don't know if maybe they're like you, they had found that their salaries and benefits were not that competitive. They were in an environment where it was really tough to compete because they were a very small school. What they decided to do was to adopt a strategy of being the best at taking young teachers and turning them into very, very good teachers, right? So they kind of did. You imagine this. Imagine telling college graduates that if you come to work for us, you're going to be underpaid. We're going to work you 50, 60, 70 hours a week. We're going to invest in you in the process, but you really are going to kind of work harder than you've ever worked in your life. Now come on board with us, right? Now that sounds like maybe not the best pitch, but did you know that's what Enterprise Rental Car does? And they hire thousands and thousands of college graduates every year. Now their graduates go on and are prepared to go work in a lot of different fields in executive leadership. They've proven to be a great training ground for people to go out and work in whatever industry they want to work in. This school adopted the enterprise model. They were not going to be able to pay much, but if you come work for us, we're going to invest in you and we're going to make you a fantastic teacher, right? And they have some teachers who come and only stay for 2 years and they finish that program and they move on, and others will stay because they just so believe in what they're doing in this school. But they paid attention to the value proposition they could offer. What they became was, quite frankly, they became the best in the world at hiring young teachers and preparing them to go off into other schools. Great feeding ground, right? And again, some will stick around. So knowing how to invest, maybe it's in interns or maybe it's, again, knowing what your value proposition is. But knowing how to build your pool here, as it says, and also leveraging your employee referrals. Some of you you make a lot of effort to try to get family referrals for students. Most great teachers know other great teachers because they want to work with people like that, and they tend to hang around people like that. Tap into the resource of your network, but building your bench is a part of school leadership, and it has to be something that's done intentionally in order to have the best bench. Because what you're looking for are not just active candidates. This is something that we teach school boards when we guide them through a search process, is that often they want to go out and they want to manage this process themselves, and so they're going to post up all these positions, just like kind of like everybody else, and they're going to try to get these candidates. You don't just want active candidates. You want passive candidates. This is true for your faculty as well. You want to find people who aren't looking for a job, but they've got the right combination. If they knew about your story, and truly your story, right? If they knew about your story and what you're doing to change kids' lives and what you're doing to invest in your faculty, man, that's like, I could believe in that. I want to work at a place like that, right? And that's the key, is knowing how to attract not just job seekers, but those that are remarkable teachers who match up with your profile, with your rubric, which I'm going to share with you in just a moment. Does that make sense? All right. Now, the performance rubric. This is the piece that will save you a lot of headaches and will also give you a great deal of cohesiveness and clarity. If those two terms don't sound familiar, they're two of the disciplines that lead to school health. Okay? School organizational health. The first two are cohesiveness and clarity. The last two are communication and consistency. In order to have a high degree of school health, you need to make sure that you're paying attention to those disciplines. Now, this will also save you from lawsuits. Boa has shared with you on many occasions some of the risks when you get into lawsuits. One of the reasons those occur a lot with independent schools is we tend to have a lot of vagueness and expectations, right? And if you will develop your rubric, you're going to have less risk of vagueness in terms of actual communications and coaching with your faculty, but also in running the risk of potential concerns or legal issues later on. So what we're looking for is creating a rubric. This is sort of a framework that we use as we guide schools through what's called a talent audit, right? How do we know, a lot of us go through financial audits and we know what those are, but how do we know what our talent mix is? And when you go through a financial audit, sometimes there's an aha moment in there where you have to go, oh, okay, I get it. And we kind of have to, your board particularly kind of has to face the brutal facts. Well, this can happen with your talent as well. Sometimes the talent mix becomes sort of a vague, hodgepodge. We kind of don't know what's going on there. You can actually know what your talent quotient is, right? Your talent quotient is your ratio of high-performing faculty to non-high-performing. And that number will be the leading predictor, I promise you, it will be a leading predictor of your enrollment growth and your funding growth, right? So This is this can take about a day to create a first draft of your rubric, right? And we actually took a school through that process again a few weeks ago out on the left coast, and we were able to guide them through them. So I'm going to show this to you just to show you what this can look like. So this was a day's worth of work. And preceding this conversation was what's called you ever done a 20-60-20 review on your faculty? You know what that is? So a 20-60-20 review is where you force a bell curve in evaluating your faculty quality. In other words, what you end up with is a bottom 20% and a top 20%. So this faculty, for example, had about 50 people on their faculty. So they had 10 in the bottom 20 and they had 10 in the top 20, right? They then had to go through and identify the adjectives that were associated with those people. Right? Why were they in the bottom 20% and why were they in the top 20%? And what they found was that the majority of the lower 20% were there because of attitude, less because of skill. There were a few that were because of skill, but the majority of them were there because of attitude. And the majority of their bottom 10%, which has been true consistently across the hundreds of schools we worked with through this process, is that the bottom 20% would self-evaluate themselves quite high. In other words, they would see themselves in the top 20% when the feedback they should be getting from the administration is that they're in the bottom 20%, right? And that gap is very, very bad for your school, and it's awful for your kids, okay? Here's the scary part. This particular school found that way too many of their bottom 20% people had been there more than 8 years, right? So some of the consequences of that for their school and for their children were pretty significant, right? So this is that face the brutal facts conversation that you have to have in order to truly have an understanding of our school health, right? So this gives us clarity. Now we can understand, for example, and by the way, the 1, the 2, the 3, the ones are people who consistently do not meet expectations. The 2s are those who sometimes meet expectations, and the 3s are those who consistently meet or exceed expectations. Okay? Question?
So Scott, can you elaborate a little bit about the bottom 20%?
Sure.
So most of the time they're fairly good teachers. They're good with their content. They're good managers of their classroom. It's the attitude.
So attitude plays, so your question was, are the bottom 20%ers kind of good in everything else, but the attitude is a limitation? No, I didn't mean to say that. When they really had to sit back and think about it, their instructional strategies were not the best. They tended to be resistors in trying to adopt new strategies. They tended to, for example, they lacked classroom discipline. That these are the things that are in the 1s. They use the term progressive. They were non-progressive. In other words, they didn't want to advance their own skills. As a matter of fact, here's a fascinating part. The bottom 20%ers, what they found, actually tried to hold their peers back. They actually tried to, almost like students, they tried to make the ones who were trying harder feel bad for trying harder. Now, I don't know if you see this on your campus, but honestly, we do hear that quite a bit, that it does have ramifications throughout. They actually found that a lot of these teachers were degrading towards students, right? So, and we actually have found that sometimes the bottom 20, they don't even like kids sometimes, right? And that's a problem. Right? That's not what we want for our teachers. So yes, there are, and honestly, going through this process, they found that they were disorganized, that they lacked, a real commitment. They were bad attitudes. They were gossips. They were resistant to help. In other words, when they received coaching and feedback, they were kind of like, hey, kind of talk to the hand. I got it, right? And so what they had to recognize was, as leadership, they had been tolerant of attitudes and performance that they really, that was a kind of a violation of who they wanted to be as a leader. right? They wanted to be better than that. So this forced them to have to step back and now think about, and what this prompted them to do, actually, they had a deadline of March 1st of yesterday to make some, that was their contract date for renewals. And by going through this process, and this is something you should do 3 times a year, by the way. You should be doing this in November, you should be doing this in February, and you should do this in May, right? Because that will recalibrate your talent quotient, and we'll see what progress you're making with your teams. Yes?
So who participates in this exercise?
These are the people who participate in a talent audit are those who have supervisory responsibilities. So it's generally the executive leadership team. And it's a fascinating process going through this, because what happens is you have leadership teams that different people around the room. And what we do is we do this privately, in other words, individually first, and then they bring it together. And what's fascinating to your question is often they don't agree. Often they're like who this person has as low performers. It's very different than what this person. So what that means is your faculty are in the state of conflict and tension. They don't know which metrics to live up to, right? How do we win, right? So this gives common language around expectations, along with how to communicate very clearly. Again, a lot of research that goes into if you want to build faculty engagement, which you do. Right? In other words, when we say engagement, we don't mean just happiness. We mean faculty who believe in the mission, who know that you have their back, who feel like they're really working for more than the paycheck. They're working for the mission and working as a team. Right? When they take the team aspect very seriously, that's what you want. Those teachers will do that far more when they have specific expectations. Right? So ambiguity is not your friend when it comes to school leadership. And this is a very simple process to begin stepping through to know what, in the context of our school, and that's why we don't come in with a prescribed rubric, because it's the context of your mission, of your history, of your leadership DNA, right, of your educational philosophy. It has to be specific to your school. And then once you create that, it then becomes something you refine over time in collaboration with your faculty. Now, their next step is to sit down with their faculty leadership and step through. This is a point 1 version of their rubric. They're now going to then sit down with their faculty leadership and have conversations together to say, hey, we want to put this together. We'd like to get your input on this. And then the next stage is to have a conversation with the whole faculty in small groups to get their feedback on it. So that by the time they finish a few months of that conversation, when they finish that at the end of the school year, they will then have a 1.0 rubric that they can use, and they'll actually start using the version even now to start guiding their hiring practices. And now I'm going to share with you in just a minute how you do that to pull this in to shape how you even interview and how you evaluate your talent pool. Question.
So we're using this to evaluate teachers
and staff, right?
Staff.
Correct.
Who evaluates?
The administration. Yep. So what happened was, that's the fantastic question. We did this for the faculty. Who does it for the administration? So we actually did that with a couple of. We did it with the head of school as well as with a couple of board members. But the board members had a particular expertise, and the head of school chose them to participate in that session. Sometimes it would just be with the head of school, with our feedback as well to kind of check and balance that. He had 2 people who he trusted deeply on his board, who had a lot of talent background, that he pulled into that conversation with him. So we went through that together. I can tell you that they also participated in this session, and there was quite a stunning conversation that happened afterwards where they got very serious about talent, and they realized that they had been way too complacent with this. And so there was a lot of energy now, in a very positive way, of what they're going to do now to have a really strong story to tell about how they select and keep faculty. A really cool thing. Yes?
So I know what I'm looking at here.
Yeah.
Apparently, your brainstorming criteria is to find your.
Correct. Yep.
But the pieces that are in there are, whether they're going on by themselves or together, are they actually thinking about specific teachers? So these little comments, do they relate to a specific teacher, or is this more broad?
They were using a list once they had their 20-60-20. They were using some of the characteristics of the people who were currently on their team. They were also using some data we provided on what makes for great teachers and what does. So they were contrasting sort of ideally what are the best traits of teachers that we know in terms of high expectations, in terms of their own commitment to professional development and learning, et cetera, to also benchmark against creating their rubric. So great question. Did I answer your question good? Okay.
But they're actually using, they're talking about names, or at least
They are. Oh yeah, they had a list. You have to have your faculty list there, and they'd already been through the 20-60-20, so that had kind of couched the conversation. If you don't do the 20-60, what our experience has been that most school administrators place a very high valuation of their faculty. You know, we have the best faculty in the world. They just love kids or whatever. But when you have to kind of peel back and look at it in a forced way, in other words, when you have to say, no, I do have a bottom 20%, and you have to put the names there, you begin sort of unpacking some of those stories of that, what's called the confirmation bias, right? There's stories that you've been telling yourself so long, you really believe those stories now, right? And you have to be able to step back from that and say, okay, now let's, in the interest of integrity, of leadership, and for the benefit of everyone, let's really look at this honestly. And the culture of the administration will greatly impact that conversation. I've had times when I've had to pull the head of school aside, because I was the head of school for 14 years. I can have that conversation with you and say, hey, knock it off. Do you see how your leadership style is impeding healthy conversations here on the team? You're going to have to reconsider how you communicate, because your body language is saying very different things than what you're saying verbally. And either I'm going to have to put you in the back of the room, or I have to excuse you because you're really impeding the conversation here, right? So it's important that this fact that the administrative culture comes into this. Do we have a level of honesty with each other? And that's a characteristic of a high-performing team. One is that everybody has a voice, and two, we can have disagreements and really, kind of hammer out the details here, but when we leave here, we're all on the same team together, right? So part of this is, even through this, is even though it feels like maybe we're peeling things apart, but we're also putting things back together where we have, again, our first two disciplines of cohesiveness and clarity. That's what we're creating an experience that actually creates some of that together, because we're getting beyond sometimes the personal barriers that have inhibited some of those conversations. We've had some heads of schools that they know they should have allowed their administrators to make certain decisions to let some people go, but they were afraid. They were afraid because of some outside influences, or they were afraid because of, well, who we're going to get to replace them. That's why we started off with fill the pool, because you'll stop making decisions out of fear if you have a great bench to pull from. Right? All right. So what happened then was they created that, and then they created their scorecard, right? So you have your rubric, then you have to go through and then back to the list of their faculty. They then had to step through each person and give them a score. Are they, and by the way, a 1, 2, and a 3. If you're a 2 in one case, let's say you're a 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2. Everything rounds down. So if you are a 1 in one category, you are a 1. The same thing is true if you're a 3, 3, 3, 2, 3, 3. You're a 2. Everything rounds down. Okay, so that it forces again. For us to hire a team that has a significant level of performance. Now, let me just give you one quick story as an aside. To prove this model out, back in December of 2013, we took a school through this process. This was a school that was in a very small town, so not a growing demographic in a southeastern state. And they really committed to trying to grow their school, and they wanted to be out really world class. And so what they did was they said they calculated their talent quotient. They ended up with about a 2.0 and a 20%. So 20% of their faculty were 3s about. And that's on average, it's around 20% starting off this process. Their goal was to grow that. And by the way, you increase that number usually in quarters or years. You decrease that number in minutes. All it takes is hiring one person who does not fit well with your culture, and they're going to take out, not only they're going to take out other employees with them, they're going to take out families. That's how important. Hiring the wrong person will cost you a minimum of $80,000 for a private school, depending on your tuition, and it can cost you as much as $500,000. Hiring the wrong head can cost you millions of dollars. So these decisions really are critical to the success of your school, right? So what happened was they went through and calculated, they calculated their TQ using this scorecard. And so notice a couple of things here is that they focused on the first is the alignment. They wanted people who had, first of all, do they get it, right? Do they get our school? Do they understand what we're about, our mission? And so, just overall, do they get us, right? And that's an important question to ask. You do not need just a math teacher. You do not just need a 5th grade teacher. You need someone who gets the bigger picture, right? Because who is in the admissions business? All of us. Who's in the fundraising business? All of us, right? You're not just here to be a teacher in an independent school. You have to buy into the bigger picture. And listen to me, trust me. If you hire them and think you're going to fix that later, forget about it. It doesn't work that way, right? You got to hire this to begin with. So you want them that they get it. Second, that they want it. They want to be a part of your program. They want to be a part of accomplishing your goals, accomplishing your mission, of being a part of your culture, right? And when they genuinely in their heart, they want it. Don't be hiring people just because you got to fill an empty seat. Hire people who want to be a part of your school. And then finally, do they have the capacity to do it? You could easily have someone who they can have the degree, they can want the job, they can believe in what you're doing, but they just don't have the capacity to do the job. That happens sometimes. So you need all 3 of those in order to build a high-performing team, okay? Now, once we have those 3, now we're going to get specific about our quantitative and our qualitative measurements, right? That goes back to the rubric. Quantitative being our numerical measurements of talent, energy, and engagement. Qualitative in terms of our mission impact, our culture and strategies impact, and our positional impact. Right? Now, this is a guide for creating your rubric. You can change that up however you want to. Here's the key. Keep it simple. What we see schools do, trying to use a very complicated process of evaluation, right? Keep it simple. The simpler it is, the more likely you are to use it, right? And by the way, you have to train your people in developing an expertise around some of these strategies. Because here's what I've noticed, and maybe you have some different experiences, but as we visited different schools around the country, and it doesn't matter if it's Ivy League schools or state schools or private schools, I have yet to talk to a Department of Education that truly teaches strategic talent and HR leadership. None. 0. Now remember the rules of 80. 80% of your budget, 80% of your headaches, 80% of your impact is in people. And yet the only thing we teach around personnel in our master's and doctoral programs is school law. All we teach is compliance. We don't teach how to build an amazing team. And that's a shame, because that's where we make the biggest impact, right? We're trying to affect that. We're having the conversations with those schools for a reason. Come on, guys, let's go. We got to catch up with the times. So building the remarkable team is the key, and knowing how to build your scorecard. Now you can go back and have some really powerful conversations, because that's what they're doing now, that school, with their current employees. Even the couple of the ones they're going to hang on to and the 2s that they're trying to coach up, right? They want to coach. Now, I didn't finish the story. So I mentioned you this small school and what they had adopted this strategy, right? So they started off with a 2.0 ratio as well as a 20% of faculty. So each year they reorganized the school, they changed their hiring practices, they began they did 3 times a year discipline process of reevaluating their talent quotient. The same process. 3 years later, so from 2013 to 2016, right? They raised more money in that 3-year period than they had in the previous 30-year existence of that school. They grew enrollment 60% in a demographic population that had flat growth, right? Almost no growth. They grew 60%. And they were in a state where they took vouchers. And that school was rated among the schools that had the highest level of student growth in the state. They did growth testing, right? Beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year, right? So this model works. It's proven out by multiple data points. If you can start building a remarkable team, your first target market is your faculty. But if you don't improve what you don't measure, right? You have to have very concrete ways of measuring faculty quality, and the administration, starting at the top, has to be able to talk about these things honestly and factually. Yes.
I'm curious about the attitude that were middle.
Yes.
That they've been there a long time.
Sure.
That did classes.
Yep.
How long did it take, or what was the process to do that?
So the question was, after they did their 2060-20, they developed their rubric, and they had low, middle, high performers, how do they interact with them? So what they had to choose, they evaluated their lowest performers based on whether they were there because of skill or attitude. The ones that were attitude and they had already invested in, they went ahead and made the decision to give them the opportunity to work somewhere else. They offboarded them, right? They then that actually ended up having an impact on a lot of their 1s and 2s, because it's you ever heard the story about if a bear or a tiger is chasing you and it's us there together, I don't have to outrun the bear or the tiger, I just have to outrun you, right? And because if I outrun you, I'm good. The same thing is true sometimes with employee performance. I don't have to be the best, I just have to outrun you. Because I know you're in the bottom, and if they're not letting you go, I'm good, right? But when they realize that the bottom is changing, it does change behavior. When you set specific expectations and you begin holding accountability to that, behavior will change. Those that don't, then it becomes easier to have a coaching conversation and allow them to make different decisions. The reason that you have these conversations in November, I mentioned specific time frames. You have to have these in November because that's your opportunity to have a very frank conversation with the folks that you know have the ability to step up, to really have a better impact. That's when you want to pour into them. You love your faculty. You want them to be successful. But you have to sometimes give those honest feedback sessions that says, hey, we got to go. I know you, because if you think this is high-level performance, I need to let you know it's not. And so this gap, sometimes you have to create what's called a significant emotional experience for this person, for them to really realize, no, I need you to change. If we stay on this path, we're going to be going different directions. Because if you don't have that conversation, in your heart, you're compromising the experience for kids, right? Because we know that when a student experiences an underperforming teacher, right, it sometimes can take up to 4 years to recover from 1 year with an underperforming teacher. I mean, the impact on this can change the trajectory of a child's life, right? So our personnel decisions that most of our schools are going to make in the next 90 days are life-changing for a lot of people. We just have to be sure that we're doing the absolute best we can to make wise decisions in our hiring and rehiring practices, right? So they had to have the conversations with some of those people. Some of them they had to counsel out. They obviously, you go in and start cleaning house, you can have a very negative impact on culture. And that's not, we're not advocating for that. We're not advocating for wholesale changes. We are advocating, though, for discipline changes. So there are a few people that most schools, when they go through this, realize that it's just not a good fit. Let's see if we can find another opportunity for them, right? We either put them on a different, as they say, seat on the bus, another position in the school, or we go ahead and move them out. They had to make a couple of really tough decisions. There were a couple of people who were long-term and long-term family history with the school, but they knew it was the right decision for their school and for their kids, and so they did it.
I'm so curious, did they offer them packages or was there any pushback?
Oh, sure there was. There was some, but in the end, when they were able to demonstrate, especially, here's the thing that they did. This is very important: is you have to know how to communicate these things. If this becomes a top-down sort of pushing it down the throats of your faculty leadership strategy, that typically causes a lot of tension and does not help faculty culture. This has to be communicated in a very disciplined way. The board has to know where you're going with this. The board, honestly, most of your board members come from a background where they're using terms like KPI, right? The key performance indicators, right? Or they're using other things that they're used to these conversations. When they come into the school world is when they kind of get surprised that we don't have some of these things going on, right? So most of the time we have found board members very receptive to learning that we do have a disciplined process for evaluating and selecting and developing our teachers, right? Because they're kind of used to sometimes they're used to kind of getting the hand or resistance when it comes to, now not just board members who have a personal experience with a teacher, but they don't believe in the process that the administration's using to select and evaluate and keep teachers, right? So there is a balance there. Board members need to be trained, and we've had a lot of problems with this recently with some boards where the board member wants to take their own experience they've had with their student or the polling that they've done with the parents and their network to say, we got to fix that math teacher, right? Or that's not an appropriate conversation to have in a board meeting at all. But that's because of board training issues, right? So they did have to involve, you have to sequence your conversations. And we've shared that in previous workshops here with PACE-BOA on the laws of the grapevine. You have to know how to sequence, frequency, and flow. And that's critical for this because you have to have buy-in from your board. You then need to have buy-in from your faculty leadership, whether they're department heads or whether they are just, whether they're paid or volunteer, whoever your key influencers are need to be drawn into this conversation. And then you want to make sure that you have the conversation with everybody, in a very constructive way, that you're gathering, you're creating a collaborative conversation, but you also have to know that once we decide on this is it. This is what we're going to use. The reason your board gets excited about that, of course, is because what's your product? See, a lot of schools think that their students are their product. And your students are not your first product. Your faculty is your first product. Families are buying teachers. They're buying coaches. They're buying staff. They're buying an experience. And the schools that understand that and do a very good job of onboarding, selecting, and engaging faculty are growing the most these days. I'm telling you. And they're hiring people who are great with relationships and have a discipline. Unquestionably, that's what's happening. So introducing this to your families, I promise you, your families will be really excited. You never publish this information, ever. Right, and even the stuff that I shared, I got permission from that school, and we talked, and there's nothing, you would never know who that school was, right? We never try to embarrass anybody publicly. So this information has to be shared in a constructive way. You want to get up in front of your parents at a back to school night or whatever, at a say to the school address or whatever, say, we are very, very strategic in developing a high performing team. And we use a process. We're not going to go into a lot of the details in that, but we have a very disciplined process of how we select, of how we recruit, of how we coach, and how we reselect our faculty. I want you to have confidence in what we're doing there. Even that, what parent wouldn't get excited about that?
But you're not showing them.
In the heavens, no. I wouldn't. Because again, the other message that you're sharing with your parents, of course, is, this is a school, this is a corporation. It's not a democracy, right? When we're not running this based on votes. This is a responsible institution that's run that way. We do have a chain of command, and you're not in it, right? So there's certain messages you have to make sure that we establish rapport and respect. But you need to know that we really are, because the biggest complaint from parents is you don't do anything about this teacher, right? Well, you need to be able to push back on that. You need to be able to anticipate those objections. We actually do have a very disciplined process and a precise process for how we measure and how we give feedback and how we develop our faculty. We are investing in them, and the head of school needs to stand up there and say, and that's my job. Because culture is his job or her job, and it's everyone's job. And that starts with how you choose and rehire your faculty. Right? Okay, so we'll now give you some specifics. So you've created your pool, and now you're sorting the pool, but you can't sort the pool unless you have your rubric. Otherwise, it's typically kind of gut feel or kind of, I mean, have you ever, or any of you ever taught how to read resumes? Yeah. Where did you learn how to read resumes? There you go. There's a discipline to it, right? I mean, and you've gotten some coaching. That's perfect. And because most school administrators, they don't have any of that background. They don't have the spouse that has an expertise in that. And they certainly didn't learn that, of course, in their graduate programs, right? Where do they learn how to interview, right? No one's taught school administrators how to do interviews. So they kind of are like, and you hope for the best, and it's gut feel, right? Do I like them? You know what the accuracy of that statistically is? About 17%. So you're taking a risk that you're going to get it wrong 83% of the time. And that's not my numbers. Those are based on a lot of research on hiring practices, right? So knowing how to do this sorting is a discipline. It's a science. It's not an art. Right? So one of the things you're looking for example, is what are the criteria we're going to use? We have our rubric, and then we want to kind of sort through their experience, their philosophy, their credentials. What we're looking for on their resume or their application is what's the data, and we've already determined this in advance because we know what our rubric is looking for, right? What's the data that we can find in this that would support moving them to the next stage in the process, right? Doesn't matter who referred them. It doesn't matter how, who they know. It doesn't matter if that's the wife of a board member, right? Stick to the discipline. So we're going to go through and make sure that we can assess their resume. Now, some of the red flags, and I'm sure that you have some from your wife's experience as well. Some of the red flags we look for is, how long have they been in different positions? I received a resume recently from someone who, over the last 10 years, they've been at each of those positions about 2 years, right? 2 years or less, actually. Well, that's a huge red flag. Either they are the kind of spirit who just can't settle somewhere, or they are very difficult to get along with, and they've been kind of cut loose. Right? So, if we want to spend the time to get to, if they really have other things on their resume that makes them look maybe really valuable, then we may move them forward. But that's one red flag we would look for is patterns of decision making, okay, and the depth of their relationship. Because in your school, does faculty tenure have an impact on culture and relationship with families? Most schools it does. So you want to, of course, hire people who they typically are really good at relationships. Someone who changes jobs that often typically is not that good at relationships. Not always, but it's a red flag. So we're looking for alignment just from the first a cursory look of kind of where they are. Then if we say that we're going to move them forward in the process, the next thing we recommend is doing an online video interview. You can use Skype, you can use Zoom. We use Zoom a lot. A couple of different tools, and there's a couple of reasons for doing this. One, it's efficient. I don't have to bring you in, and it's for us it's better than the phone call because I can actually see body language, and most of the time in education, body language is a very important communicator. So I also want to know, do they have the technology expertise that they can actually get their video set up and use it well. I look for, do they pay attention to lighting? Do they pay attention to angle, right? Because if they're talking at it like this and the video's down here and they're looking up at me, they're kind of looking down or whatever, they haven't thought about angle. And so I want, because usually in the schools that we're hiring today, they got to have some technology, aptitude, right? So I want to know that they can solve some of these. If they're having to call me to figure out how to set up their Skype on their computer, I'm probably not going to hire them, move them forward in the process, because they need to know how to figure that out. Or don't have, go find your resources to figure that out. I'm looking for their digital presence and especially their professionalism, right? Did they prepare well for the conversation? Have they done some homework? I want to know that they know us, that they're not just applying for a job, but they've really gotten to know us as a school. And I'm very interested in the questions that they ask, far more interested in the questions they ask than the answers to my questions. Right? And then we're looking for tone of voice and body language, looking for professionalism. Is this somebody, if we put them up in front of our families, that they're going to represent us well? Okay? So that's the second stage. We call that the validation interview. What we do, though, in guiding through this is we do the resume sequence. We're stepping through, like I mentioned earlier, we're really just stepping through to understand, are there any gaps in their resume? That's another red flag that we're looking for. Like, we did one job in 2012, and the next job started in 2014, right? Okay, wait a minute. What happened here? What's that gap? What happened during that time period? And so we just kind of can talk that through. And then we're also looking for why they made the changes to each job. Just real quickly, just give me quick answers. Why you left this job, and then why did you take this next job? That's all I want to know. Right? Because again, I'm looking for what motivates them and what attracted them to different jobs. I will also ask the question, of all these jobs, what was your favorite job? Just want to know, and then why? Because I want to know, was this a job where, well, they let me do my thing and left me alone, right? Well, then that means they're going to be the kind of teachers that are going to be in their four-wall kingdom, and they're never going to come out and connect with everybody else, right? So I just want to know why, what was your most beloved job and why? Any questions on that? Any thoughts about, yeah?
To refer back to the graph, you have the criteria of gets it, wants it, and can do it.
Yes.
Invested to do it. As far as the current faculty, I think those three are easy to assess. But in the interview, I think I can figure out gets it, I can figure out capacity to do it.
Right.
But the wants it, do you have any advice on how to get it the wants it? Because, you can be a good interviewer that can express
Absolutely.
it very easily, or you can really want it and just not a very good interviewer.
It's a great question. And if you guys have any thoughts on that as well, you're free to share. What we look for is, one, have they done their homework? Do they really make the effort to know us? And not only us as an organization, but do they really know what we're about? So we'll ask them, maybe some specific questions around, what is it about our mission that most interests you? Right? And what, and to identify specific characteristics of our mission. What is it about our culture and the history of our school that really is engaging for you, right? So, because again, I want to know, have they made that extra effort? A lot of it's going to be found out later on in the process. I know a little bit about this here, because you're right. They could express some of that in a 30-minute conversation, but when we get further in the process, then I'm really going to get into, do they want this position, right? And so we'll talk more about that. The next thing we're going to do is use some assessments. And this is something that we see some schools doing pretty well with this. Others are kind of having them do assessments, but they're really not sure what to do with it. A couple of the assessments that we have found are useful are Strength Finder. Now, these are assessments that we use to benchmark against our historical hiring practices. In the first session that we did in the fall, it was called Finding the Gold in Your HR Filing Cabinet. And that was about how to learn from past hires, right? So what you have to go back and do is, of your top 20% people, what are their characteristics? Go back and look at their HR records to figure out, where did they go to school? What are their strengths? What are their natural instincts, right? Now you're going to start to see a pattern of what makes for a talent mix that is the best for our school. And when we say talent, we mean their skills, their intelligences, their values, their personality, their instincts, and their strengths. Those are the 6 things that make up what we call the elements of talent. And there are objective ways to measure all 6 of those, right? The Kolbe A index will tell you how they naturally take action, or what are called cognitive instincts. And so if you hire a teacher, for example, who what is called a high quick start, and that's someone who typically is a more what's called an innovator or an entrepreneur pattern. If you hire someone who's naturally wired that way, and you have a curriculum that's very scripted and very prescribed, that's not going to be a good fit, right? So you don't want to hire somebody with an entrepreneurial pattern in a classical school. It just doesn't work well. That's going to be conflicting, right? Nor do you do that if you have a leadership team that typically is very much large and in charge, and make sure that the teachers are really following the rules, because entrepreneur patterns, guess what they like to do? Break the rules, right? So if you're at a school that encourages that, allows some of that, like there's a couple of people on Springside Chestnut Hills campus, as we've worked with them, who they have a couple of entrepreneur patterns, but they have a program to support that they can participate in their entrepreneur center and some of the other things that allows for that, right? You have to have a culture that matches with their natural instincts. Right? But no, if you take the time, you can use your 20-60-20 to study your current high performers and learn from them. We had one group of schools we helped do some recruiting. They were actually charter schools up in Detroit. And what we learned that that their most outstanding teachers actually had to pay their way through college. I mean, they didn't just have to have a job to have some spending money. They had to bust their tails in order to get through school, and they had to work their way through. And we found that to be a consistent pattern. So guess what we went out and hired? People who had to work their way through college, right? We wanted people who were on work study. We wanted people who really had to just barely get by sometimes. It's like I heard the president of Georgia Tech speak one time. It was a fascinating conversation, because sometimes when you're looking at resumes, you want the person who went to an Ivy League school or something else. And so it was really interesting to hear him talk. And so he was speaking to a large group of alumni and parents in the room. And he said, when I go on these tours and I speak to different groups, he said, as I evaluate my students, here's what I have found to be very true. When I look at my A students, I know they're my future professors. I mean, they're the ones that will teach and be able to do a lot of things. He said, when I look at my B students, they're the ones who will be able to go out and they may be on our administrative team, or they're going to go out and be some game changers out in the community. But when I look at my C students, those are my largest donors. Yeah. My C students are always the ones who give the most money, because they're the ones who end up being the entrepreneurs who are so successful. Right? And the funny thing was, I was sitting next to 2 of the largest donors to Georgia Tech, and they were both said, "Yep, that's me. I was a C student." One guy said, "I just barely got out of here." Right? And so it's interesting, sometimes when you're looking at those resumes for hiring purposes, you may not always want the person who made straight A's at Harvard. You want the person who has the talent mix, right? And they get it, want it, and have the capacity to do it. That's where all this kind of comes together. Does that make sense? Another one to use is predictive index. I know that Pace Bow has had a relationship with them for a while. Phenomenal way of matching up the expectations for the job to the makeup of the person, right? So using some tools like that are fantastic ways of making better decisions. That's making a data-driven decision. You can increase the accuracy of your hiring up over sometimes 50, 60, 70% by using these assessment tools in the right way. The other thing we know for sure about teachers is they do have high IQs. The best teachers, then they're not geniuses necessarily, but they do have on the higher scale of IQs. That has been a consistent pattern of the best teachers. Yes?
Scott, in the interest of a different voice for a second.
Yeah.
I thought maybe I could comment, because I did the work in negotiation, et cetera, with David Lunkman for our...
For predictive index, yes. Mm-hmm.
Predictive index. And I think some of you, this will tie in very much to a couple of things that you said earlier. And in particular, I first met David Lunkman and his work with SCHA maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I just sat back and waited for him to develop his experience with independent schools. by that is, by that time, he had understood how schools make decisions, and in particular, how they do a lot of committee kind of interviewing in
Yes.
that context. And what he discovered is that schools weren't necessarily well organized to do that.
Right.
What I mean is, they didn't have agreement between those people as to what the most important characteristics were, et cetera. So when we put together an agreement with David, which seems to have a reasonably high price tag, the price tag is fine because of the value of making a good decision versus the price of making a bad one. But it's a package deal. You can't just take the tests, which
Right.
are inexpensive in effect, but you need to buy into the key hire project itself, which has an investment in David working with a group of people to make sure that they're all on the same page as you go into this process. And that makes the test results more understandable because you've already agreed on a set of things to focus on.
Right.
So I just thought I'd comment on that.
Thank you for that.
Particularly, we as an organization, or I, didn't look at the others because at that point I flushed the one out developmentally that I thought would work for us.
Sure. Thank you for that. Any other questions on assessment? Do any of you use other assessments in your hiring process? None? Okay. All right.
I just want to comment about PI, and we're using it as a
Using predictive index, okay.
yes, and we're also using it for a team building. I mean,
Nice.
the existing teams
Yeah.
we all have different, very different PIs. We can understand why each of us are in the position that we're in.
Right.
But yet, sometimes it does, it's challenging to deal with all these different PIs. And we're working on that. It's actually something to work with.
Nice. It's again, it's a science. It does take work, but what you're trying to build is a cohesiveness and a clarity, and those are the two fundamental disciplines of school help. So that's a fantastic thing that you're doing there.
And we're using them routinely. I mean, everybody's brought into it, whether
Yeah.
or not we're always listening to the way we should.
Yeah.
We just made a hire that, God, if we had listened to that PI, we might have made it.
You didn't listen. Oh. That's the other thing you have to do is you have to listen to the data. Like the data doesn't lie, all right, for sure. Any other questions about some of the assessments? Okay. Now, this is the second interview, right? So this is we've done the validation interview. Now we get into the alignment interview. Now, what we're recommending here, to Al's point, very few administrators have learned how to do any type of interviewing. And so creating a panel just exponentially raises the number of confusions, not accuracy. Panel interviews do not work. They're proven over and over again to provide very little useful data for making the right hiring decisions. But tandem interviews, in other words, where you use two people in a strategic way, can be very effective, right? We use tandem interviews because one person becomes the scribe while the other person is asking questions, and then you alternate. The questions are predetermined, and what they're designed to do is to get in underneath to find very specific answers to the traits that you're looking for on your rubric, right? It doesn't matter. We're not looking for asking questions like, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Tell me about yourself. You know, there's no predictive accuracy from those questions, right? Knowing how to ask very specific questions will help you become far more accurate in your interviewing. And please remember, you need to train your decision makers, your hiring supervisors, your administrators in how to do this. They do not come with this. Right? And even if they've been hiring people for 30 years, that means they have 30 years of poor training for the most part. Knowing how to use a science to this is critical. So the first thing we recommend is, what were you expected to do for each position? For each position, we're asking these questions. What were you expected to do? What were your most significant accomplishments in that role? Okay? We're asking them, what were a few of the low points for you? Specifically, for whom did you work? And this is a critical question. because we want to get the specific name, because the next thing is when we talk to this person, not if I was to, it's when we talk to this person, how are they going to describe you? And this is a powerful question. This is the question that it's like the ultimate question, and you've heard of the Net Promoter Score in terms of the question to ask in doing surveys, right? How likely are you to recommend family and friends to our school? This is the question when it comes to interviewing, because the body language responses you're going to get from this is why you have two people in the room, because the person who's interviewing doesn't have their head down trying to write notes. They're looking for body language. Does the person lean back and cross their arms? Do their eyes go kind of down to the left and they kind of pause for a second, right? Or are they coming back with, oh yeah, I'd love for you to talk to them, because they would really love to. Well, I've had people say, oh, you're really going to talk to them? Well, I probably should tell you about something, and they describe a situation that you wouldn't have known about, right? Now, reference checking we'll talk about in just a minute, but it's important that you can communicate to the candidate that you are going to check references, because you are going to check references. That is the worst habit that schools have, is not checking references, and not even knowing how to check references is as much of a discipline as interviewing. If you're checking references just to check the box and say, I checked references, yay for me, right? Big mistake. All right, so we'll talk about that in just a second. So,
When I talk to them, are you really going to call that person?
of course, you have to. But if okay. So, what if they don't know the person?
But what if they don't know that they haven't told the boss they're leaving?
Oh, well, we're not going to call them yet. I mean, they would have to. Well, okay, now that's a great question. Let me pause for a second. The question is this: what if you're talking to a candidate who has not informed their current supervisor that they're interviewing? So let's shift hats for a second. If you have somebody on your team who's interviewing, do you want to know about it? I mean, typically you do. You have to evaluate inevitably, and I know the idea of the fear of reprisal in those situations. Our rule as school leaders, and I enforce this with my administrators as a school head, is you never move someone further on as a candidate to this process unless they had informed their current school that they were considering options. Because for me, that was an integrity issue. If they were willing to go behind the back of their current leadership, they'd be willing to go behind my back as well, not only with interviewing decisions, but potentially other decisions. And I wanted to create a culture of no secrets, no surprises, because I found that to be most effective for school culture. So you have to make that decision as a team. What are you going to do with that? I've literally had interviews where I asked that question and they said, I haven't told them yet, and the interview stopped right then. And they had to go home, and we had to go back and revisit that after they informed their current supervisor. Because that was a rule that we set as a school, that we weren't going to do that. We had so many schools that they would end up hiring someone like from our faculty. They didn't even check references. They just hired. A couple of them I was like, you hired that person? Good luck. It was like no real thought to it. But the point of that is you have to decide that, but yes, I'm not going to call them right then, but they have to know that we are going to have that conversation so that we can be clear about, because what we're going to ask for example, is, what was your experience working for him or her, and then what are they going to say about that? And we also want to know, why did you leave that position, right? And will the person that we're going to talk to corroborate what you're saying, or will it be any different from what you've said? Right? Again, just easy ways to validate what they're saying and to make sure that we're using a disciplined approach to evaluating the candidates. Does that make sense? Okay.
Not only, that's also an understanding and expectation of case competition, and also it's an understanding among heads. And I know in this area, I get to
Right.
the Southeast GPA, most of us have an agreement that we will have. When it gets to the
Good.
second interview, final interview, that we will get a phone call. I've been in that position where I've had to say, if we're going to move forward with this, you have to tell
Yeah.
your head of school.
Yep. And we've been in some associations where that was the case. They had that agreement. It wasn't always followed, but yes. And it's important that is revisited as well as encouraged, and including the reasons why, not just the policy itself, but why this is important for your school culture also. Okay? All right. So we're going to go through what we're trying to make sure we have alignment with, and you can use a couple of different tools to do this. We're trying to make sure that we have strong alignment, first with mission, right? Because we have a very specific mission for our school. We're looking for alignment with our culture. If you want a culture that is warm and friendly, don't hire that teacher that's sarcastic and has that biting tongue, right? That typically doesn't match well with the culture you're trying to build. Hire for culture. That was the biggest thing we learned from Google. And by the way, this whole conversation is not based on kind of us just kind of reading some books or other things. We actually talked to Chick-fil-A. We talked to Google. We talked to Apple. We talked to Disney. We wanted to know from them, what do you do? What do you do to become so remarkable when it comes to talent? So all of this we're sharing with you is from those conversations. The biggest thing we learned in the conversation with Google, with the VP of HR there, was culture, culture, culture. Hire for culture, train for skills. Culture has to be the number one priority, right? And so when you're hiring, you just got to know very specific of what is the culture you want to build, and then don't think you're going to fix people later. You're not going to fix adults. The kids in your school, yeah, maybe, but not the adults, okay? And especially don't put them on your payroll. If they're parents in the school, that's a different thing. And then strategies, right? Whatever strategies we're using as a school, we want to make sure we have strong alignment there. And then finally, position, right? Most of our schools that we talk to, they're hiring for position first, right? They're hiring a teacher, or they're hiring a coach, or they're hire for mission, culture, strategies first, and then hire for the position. So as you're interviewing all the way through, make sure that you're selecting on that. So now we have strong alignment in these areas. The next thing we want to look at is a demonstration interview, right? Show me the money, all right? How many of the Philadelphia Eagles have they given contracts to without watching game film? How many hours of game film will they have watched per player? Thousands of hours, right? Thousands of, the combines are going on now. How much time will they spend watching college game film of those players, right? You gotta see them do it. If you're hiring, even if you're hiring a receptionist, make them write a letter right there in front of you. If you're hiring a teacher, make them teach. What you're looking for, of course, is their knowledge. Do they have a knowledge of the material they're responsible for teaching? Do they have the pedagogical practices that align with what you're expecting? Do they have the preparation? When we have teachers do this, we of course are reviewing their lesson plans. I want to see how they structure their lesson plans. I want to see literally the outline and how what is the discipline of their planning. Really, really important. If I'm in a school that highly values preparation and organization, sometimes even handwriting can be a good thing to look at as you have. So we usually have them do handwritten communications. I had every teacher write an email right there. I mean, literally handed them a computer to say, write me an email, and here's the topic. I want to see, can they structure an email in a way that communicates and represents our school? How many times are your teachers sending emails to parents? Daily. Well, then make them write an email. Why not, right? These are important techniques to use. You want to see it. You want to see them demonstrate the capabilities to do the key aspects of the job, right? And then finally, we're looking for responsiveness. Part of that session needs to be structured where there's real students in the room, or you're in the room with adults and you have questions prepared to force them to adapt their teaching style. If they just get up there and regurgitate a bunch of facts, that is not demonstrating real life teaching, at least not in the schools that I want. What we want to be able to do is see how they respond to questions and respond to stimulus in the room that forces them to demonstrate even in classroom management issues, right? And capabilities. If you can have them substitute teach for a week, let them do that. I mean, that's a great way to get to know them, right? So one of the things we see, we've had a couple of schools that have been very aggressive at building out their substitute teacher pool. I mean, they actually try to hire prospective teachers in their sub pools. They're not just using parents and filling in gaps. That their sub pool really is their hiring pool. So maybe that's a way to do it, right? It may be hard to do that, but it'd be something to consider. Any questions on the demonstration interviews? Yes, sir.
I met last summer with a local staffing agency. A couple of people that work there happened to have some experiences with our schools, which has got them in, if you will, to talk with me.
Interesting.
One of the things I learned was how common it is now for organizations to use the temporary hire to evaluate candidates for positions.
Oh, interesting.
Very, very common. And they have
Oh, yeah.
agreements that can be used for that purpose, if that's a background possibility.
Hmm.
So it's much more common than I realized, as opposed to just filling in the need temporarily.
Good point. Any other thoughts or questions on that? Yes, ma'am.
I'm thinking about administrative positions. And they
Yes.
have, school, and there's so much pressure, for example, with a development position, where we're tending to look at position, but not mission, culture, strategies first.
Right.
So I guess I wonder your thoughts on, is it still the same order, even in a position which calls for very specific skills and very.
And what's this position again?
Well, I'm thinking of development.
Development, yep. So your development director is going to be communicating with a lot of key funders for your school, right? And they're going to be responsible for communicating the story of your school. Having a development director who is not aligned with your mission, culture, and strategies is a recipe for disaster. We actually had one school with their development director. We had to do a coaching session where this person went to a birthday party and not understanding the development director is part of the team, right? And understanding that you're an ambassador for the school 24/7. If you're on our payroll, it doesn't matter who you are. That hat never comes off. So ended up going to a birthday party with some of the other families, and some of the other families were expressing some concerns about another teacher or some other situation. And the development director jumped into the conversation and was echoing some of the complaints and the things. That is the worst decision for that development director to make, right? Undermined cohesiveness, undermined culture in a very, very poor way. So you absolutely want to make sure that if they're receiving a paycheck from the school, they should be completely aligned with your mission, culture, strategies, and their position. No question.
So as a small school, sometimes we struggle with, oh my God, here comes this person that has
Right.
all this
Man.
unbelievable experience.
Yes.
Knows this software and can pull the data.
Absolutely.
Spreadsheets.
Yep.
But,
Amazing talent.
then.
Yeah, but no alignment. Yep. And what does it cause? It causes tension. So that causes tension in your school design, and it inevitably has consequences that you don't want. I mean, we had one school where literally the administration, they have different hallways for different grade levels. It was a very, very large school, and some of the administrators didn't even want to walk down the hallway where the IT director was and this other teacher was, because they were so negative and would always were poisoning the whole culture. And of course, what was my question to them? Why? Why? Why are you doing this to yourselves? I mean, how much time do you spend doing damage control because of the attitudes and the lack of commitment and alignment of these people? Why do you do that to yourselves, right? Because what is it like? Think about this for a second. What is life like for an administrator that has, let's dream big for a second. Let's say 80% of the faculty were high performing. I mean, they had all the disciplines, but they got them to the point they had 80% were threes. What's life like for that administrator? Right? I mean, think about it. An administrator with that type of talent, how often do kids get sent to the office? Really never. I mean, hardly ever. Because great teachers they never send, because their classroom management, relationship building skills, I mean, they got it, right? How about this? How often do you have to do damage control with a parent behind a high-performing teacher? Never. because they're relationship building with families. They know how to create the conversation. They know how to listen. They know how to build engagement. They know how to build trust. Right? I mean, there's a lot of as administrator, how often do I have to go around and sometimes avoid the classrooms of high-performing teachers? I mean, because your admissions office will typically skip those classrooms on the tour, right? And it's really easy to know where your lowest performing teachers are. Just watch the admissions tour. They always will skip the mean teachers, the teachers who are disorganized, or where they're unpredictable, right? It's a really easy man. I always knew that as a head of school. I would always watch especially the kindergarten tour. That was a really good one because the kindergartners always want to evaluate the whole school, right? And it's a really interesting thing to watch and see how it goes. So knowing that the impact of those people, if they're on your pay, if they're representing your school, they need to represent the school, the whole school. They need to be an ambassador for the school. That's the only way you get to the level of, again, I keep reiterating this, you have to have school health. You will not outgrow that aspect of your school because it'll keep pulling you back.
What if this person's life, whatever, produces? Yeah, and the
Very productive, yeah.
production
Sure.
numbers and data.
Right, so they'll be, that's why we have on that rubric, we have quantitative outcomes and we have qualitative outcomes. Because what happens is you have someone who is very productive, but nobody likes them for the most part, right? And those are some of the hardest ones to fire. The other ones are the ones that everybody likes, but they don't do anything. That's the other side of the equation. So we create, out of the rubric, we create a very simple scale, and you can track that up, and those, you've identified the two that are the hardest. But again, what's your purpose? I mean, if your purpose is to build culture for great teachers to thrive, someone like that, are they building culture? Are they making it a place where other great faculty want to be a part of it? Are they encouraging, are they bringing energy and engagement? Typically not. So, you have to make that decision for your school, but in a small school especially, one hire like that will take out a lot of people. So you just have to know there are unintended consequences that will happen regardless of who they are or what their IQ is or other talents they have. All right, so now this is where we got to make sure we complete the process, okay? This is our references interview. This is not just checking references. This is not just poking the box on this, Ron. This is going deep, okay? Going deep, right? So here's what we want to know. There's a couple of questions that we ask in reference checking. And the reason we're checking references is because past performance is usually the best predictor of future results, right? So you may not know this, but private schools are included, in general, nationally, are included in a group of organizations that are rated the highest risk when it comes to employment insurance, right? And that's true of faith-based schools, non-faith-based schools. That schools end up often being what are called employers of last resort. They will hire people sometimes that no one else will hire, and their processes for hiring typically are not as stringent as other organizations. So when you look at the actuarial tables for private schools when it comes to risk insurance, they're rated at very high risk. Because, a big part of that is because of how little we do when it comes to the discipline of hiring and especially of reference checking, right? So, we want to give you very specific ways of checking references. For us, this is the most important part of the interviewing process, right? Because now is where we find out really how aligned they are with your mission, strategies, cultures, and position. First question we ask is, if you were in my position, would you hire this person for this role? So we're not really asking a lot of ratings of 1, 2, 3s or other things. We really want to know just straight up. And we've had a little bit of conversation. We've introduced the role, who we are. There's been a little bit of small talk that's gone into this. But now we're going to ask this very bluntly. If you were in my position, would you hire this person for this role? We're looking for two things, again, attitude and the ability to have a very, very constructive and positive attitude. And we're looking for someone who builds relationships in a profound way. So we asked them a couple of questions then. What adjectives would you use to describe this person's work, right? We're trying to match up the adjectives that they use with our rubric. Are these going to be, are there adjectives they're using, are they aligning with 1s, 2s, or 3s, right? Because we could hire a 2, but a 2 will bring our TQ down. If it's a 2 that can become a 3, awesome. But this is where it changes your thinking and your hiring practice. If you know you have to look at that number 3 times a year, then you're going to start paying attention to the decisions you make in the hiring process. You're not just filling a seat that has to be hired before you get to August. You're hiring a strategic leader for your school. You're hiring a team member, right? You're hiring a person to change a kid's life. So when you have to look at those numbers, what happens? Well, you start asking different questions, right? You're going to be much more concerned about, does this person align with our rubric? Do they have the right pieces to come in and be very successful here? Can they change lives, right? Because when you start looking at the data, when you start looking at it that way, I promise you, you will start making different decisions. We're just wired that way. It's like if you want to improve your health, right? I don't know if you know this or not, but you could use, if you have like a smartphone, you can use an app like a Lose It or some of the others. You just tracking your eating in the app, even if you don't change your behavior intentionally in any way, if you don't change how many vegetables you eat intentionally or exercise more, just by looking at the data, you will improve your health 17%. Right? Just because you have to type that in, oh my gracious, look at how many calories are in that sandwich, right? Or in that for me, it's that sweet tea. That's the big temptation for me. But when you do that, it causes that number to go higher. Like, maybe I'll make that decision differently. 17% just by looking at the data, right? The same thing is true with your school quality. You will improve your school quality really exponentially when you start looking at this data. So we want to ask the questions as well. The next question would be, would you work for him or her? Right? Would you, if they were your boss, would you go to work for them? And then we're looking for relationships. What is it like to work with this person? What can we do for him or her? Now, this is an important question. We want to know from this person's experience, what is something we could do for him or her that would help them be remarkably successful? They'll fill in the gap there on that question. We have found to be a very, very good question because they're answering the weakness question in a different way, right? And then finally, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely would you be to choose him or her to teach a member of your family or to work with a member of your family? We don't say child or whatever because sometimes people don't have children or whatever. So we just say how likely, scale of 1 to 10, would you be to choose this person to work with or to teach a member of your family? Right? Very insightful information that can come from this. So we try to keep the references checking to about 15 minutes. But it's important that we are thorough enough in our conversation with them that we feel like we've gotten affirmation of our data, right? This is why if you try to do this process without a rubric, it's very frustrating. You have to have the rubric for it to work. You can build a rubric in a day if you know how to do it. But it's important that you get through that process and can start having those conversations because otherwise you have nothing to measure against. Again, it's back to luck of the draw. And that's a terrible way to impact kids. So if you want to know more, yes?
That question. So, I always struggle with these
Yeah, right.
Go to service, certificate, buy tires, and put them on, they give you things, and then please call this number. And,
Yeah, tell me how good the experience was, yes.
tell us, and please rate us a 10.
Yeah.
Because you changed my tires and put them on the car. You did what I expected you to do.
Sure.
Do I give you a 10 for that?
Right.
So here you're saying, how would you rank it? What's the right answer? If the answer is 7, you hire the person. The answer is
Yep.
8, 9, 10.
I mean, we're looking for an answer of an 8, 9, or 10, but certainly a 9 or a 10. Because if they're not that enthusiastic about the person, I don't know that I really want them on our team.
So
So
I would have thought thought 8 to 10 would have been acceptable, but.
Yeah, and that depends. So it depends on where they are.
And
If,
the other question is, so are you getting commentary when you ask them that? You know, they
of
say-
course, yeah. Any insight you could? That's right. That's a great point. A little commentary is always helpful. If I'm hiring someone that's in any type of administrative role, no, nothing less than a 10. I would never hire somebody who answered that question with less than a 10. Just because if they have not left that strong of an impression elsewhere, I don't think they're going to do that for me either. It's just a big risk, and I'm not willing to take that. If you're going to be on our team, we're going to invest in you in amazing ways, but you have to make us better also. That's a reasonable expectation, I think, for a school administrator. And honestly, the higher you set the expectations, people respond to them. As long as, in our company, we do the same thing. We do absolutely all of this in our hiring. And we're very specific about our core values. Our first core value as a company is be lovable. We want to hire people. We want people on our team who have a genuinely, they know how to love other people, and they're just lovable people, right? Another one for us is 5% more. We always want to give 5% more. And so when we're evaluating people, we're looking for, are they comfortable with just doing what's required to get by, or are they willing to go the extra mile? And do they do that intuitively?
So another thought that I always think about.
Yeah.
Try to determine what makes a person successful. What I like to tell people is that we will give you the tools you need to succeed.
Okay. Yes.
And so the organization prepared to do that. So for example, one of your questions was, what can we do for him or her?
Yes. That's right.
So I don't know what the answer is. The answer said, well, if you did 1, 2, or 3, or 1 and 2, you'd have a great employee.
Right.
Then the question that comes back to me is that, is the organization prepared?
Oh, that's exactly right. That's the reason for asking the question, right? Are they at a point where we can provide that level of support? Like if they tell us, well, if you can just make it where they don't have to work but 4 hours a day, well, that's, as long as they don't have to be at work by 8 o'clock, well, that's probably not going to work, right? So we are looking for specific answers to that. But yes, those are great questions. Any other questions on that? Yes.
So this is more broad.
Okay.
Of the whole process. So 95% of the time, I would say, fairly consistent. Ask the same interview questions, follow the same process.
Mhm.
Do the demonstration lesson, try to compare apples to apples, each candidate.
Great.
And I love consistency, but what about flexibility, especially for the head of school? So what about the lateral move or the promotion, the internal lateral moves or the promotion, or that teacher who, was on, took a break to have a family, who is a great teacher, who's a great fit, and you don't want to go through the process, and you just want to hire them without interviewing anyone. Where is that a bad idea? There's a room for flexibility.
Yeah, great point. So the question is we have some people internal to the organization, and if we want to consider them for another position within the organization, what's the process we should apply for them to move? Is that true?
And also external candidates who might be a good fit.
Okay.
And if you don't, do you still try to be consistent, have them go through this entire interview process, interview the candidates?
Yeah.
Hire them, do not.
Well, so the interviewing process, the selection process should be a part of culture as well. You're establishing an expectation with the candidate, regardless if they're your brother-in-law or someone you know really, really well, a friend who you've worked with previously. You still want to take them through the process so that the other people on the team can participate in that process and they can validate the decision to hire this person. Right? Because if this person comes back to not be a good fit and you didn't take them through the process, that's going to impact your leadership reputation, right? So you've compromised because of personal connection or whatever else. So we would say every external candidate should go through the entire process, every single one of them. Internal candidates, we do like building a culture where people can move up in the organization or find a better fit for their skills, either one. But if you're going to move them around, we did a data analysis. One of the things we do for schools is we'll do an enrollment data audit, because your enrollment data audit will tell you some very important things, even about your teachers. especially if you can do your enrollment audit by division, by grade, by teacher. Lower school, that's easier to do than it is. You can do teams at middle school and upper school. That data will tell you a lot. So we're going through this analysis of this enrollment data for the school. It's actually a school here in Pennsylvania. And we went through, we got them, it took a while to get the data together. Most schools we go into, they don't really have this, so they don't know how to use their enrollment data to combine it with their financial data to make better decisions. Really powerful things can happen. So anyway, as we're going through it, we kind of got it compiled together, and we're looking at the matrix that we have, and we said, kind of an odd thing happening here. For a couple of years, you have you have a pattern in third grade where there's a teacher. We don't have names. There's no names on this, but there's a teacher in third grade who kids are leaving in second grade and they're leaving in third grade. They're leaving in fourth grade because that's what happens. If you have a teacher who's an underperforming teacher, they'll leave before they get there. They'll leave after that experience, and then leave the next year. Right? Very consistent pattern. And so, okay, this is happening in third grade, then all of a sudden it goes away, and it's happening in fifth grade the next 2 years. Did you move a teacher from third to fifth grade? And both of the administrators looked at us. They almost turned white. They said, how did you know that? Right? Well, it's right there. I mean, so what happened was they took a teacher who was, this person wasn't real great at working with 9-year-olds, so now we're going to punish the 11-year-olds, and then some of the 11-year-olds who had her 2 years ago have to go through her again, right? So, we just kind of have this mentality. So if you're going to move people internally, they ought to be 3s. Or they ought to be 2s that you have a high degree of confidence, and the reason that they're 2s is skill and not attitude. And those differentiations are critical to agree to as a team. So heads of schools have to be willing to have the humility to listen to their team. And that's the important part of understanding talent, and that talent, the 6 elements of talent, is there is no well-rounded person. Even the head of school is not a well-rounded person. There's only well-rounded teams, right? And so being able to pick your team is absolutely critical. And this is your chance. I mean, that's the thing. As I talk to so many heads of schools, and they're so dominated by the tyranny of the urgent. I mean, they run around like chickens with their heads cut off. I mean, they might as well take off the tie and put on a fireman's hat, because that's all they're doing. They're putting out fires all over the place. I mean, this is 95% of the heads we talk to. They're constantly putting out fires. Do you know why they're putting out fires? Because they haven't hired the right people. The people who are building high-performing teams, you never see that. Their quality of life, the ability to focus on doing the things they want to do, is completely different. This is self-inflicted pain, right? Not only on us as administrators, but on our kids, right? And most of the, what's kind of scary is as we do some of these conversations with different associations and schools around the country, one of the things we'll ask is, so tell me about the organizations that you know of that are remarkable when it comes to talent, right? So, and the same list is produced almost every time. It's Chick-fil-A, it's Apple, it's Disney, it's Nordstrom's, it's Ritz, so they make the list, right? And I say any organization that you can think of that's remarkable when it comes to talent. We've done that hundreds of times. And what's scary, so, as we're finished that, so, there's 2 things about this that are really scary. And so the first thing is that none of you mentioned a school. None. And no one's ever mentioned a school in that process. And so the second thing is the consequences. The consequences of these people making poor hiring decisions. If Disney doesn't make the right hire, what happens? Well, maybe a ride isn't run the correct way, or a costume or something else isn't done correctly. If Chick-fil-A doesn't get it, maybe they don't say my pleasure when you say thank you or something else, right? But if you don't get it right, you change a child's life potentially, right? I mean, that's a very significant consequence to make the decisions the way that we do when it comes to personnel, right? So we just have to be more conscious of what are we really doing here? Are we trying to fill seats? Are we trying to hire teachers and coaches and staff members? Or are we trying to hire a remarkable team to change kids' lives? Are we just a dispenser of curriculum, or are we a dream factory? Because your approach to hiring and building a team will change based on what you really believe about that. My recommendation, become the dream factory. Become the place where kids can go to find purpose, where faculty can accomplish their purposes, and they can change kids' lives, which is why they went into this profession in the first place, right? If this is something that intrigues you, we can set up a free analysis with you. This is something we offer to PACE BOA members. So if you want to be a part of that, this is a online video session to look at some of the talent strategies and to help you make some decisions. This is an important time. I mean, you guys are in the throes of it right now, where you've got to renew contracts and you've got to make some decisions and adapt your hiring practices. It's a whole lot easier to do that if you've got some of these disciplines in place and you have your rubric. Your performance rubric is your game changer. All right. Any questions at all on any of this topic? Yes, ma'am.
I might be wrong, but I have this memory of something that saying about not getting too much into the referencing, talking about this, anything that's the legal aspect.
Sure.
So I just wanted to.
Yep. And so there's risks not for the school. There's more risks for the person giving you the references. So they have to be careful. You, of course, have to keep that information confidential. But, you know, they can say they can't answer the question if they want to, but that's something that you can take up. You know, obviously, if someone like your attorney will give you some advice on that. My experience has been that the HR office and the attorneys that may be on the board will give advice that is risk averse and will sometimes distract from your real purpose of being there to make the tough decisions. So the head of school has to balance that out. Making hiring decisions out of fear is a very poor leadership decision and one that we would discourage at all costs.
Oftentimes in these corporate side of things,
Yeah. Did they work for you or not and what they're, yeah. Right. That's right. They can be, you're right. So you may have to go take them out for a beer. You may have to do something else to try to get to know that person enough. You know, if you apply for working at certain government agencies, they're going to do background checks on you to actually talk to your neighbors, and they're going to really dig into. I mean, how far do you go, right? You need that information. You need that data to know before you put them in front of these kids for a year to shape their lives. So, you know, everybody's got to decide how far they're willing to go. I haven't found schools to receive that type of training that often, so they're usually pretty open about it. You have to assure them of the confidentiality of it, but yeah, I think that it's important to ask the questions. It can be, unless they're trained that way. Some of them require that. Yeah. 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 What was your question?
I just was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the panel versus interview.
Oh, right. Okay. So, and you could actually research, when I'm using the term tandem interviews, it comes from a book called Top Grading, which is a really thick book that's kind of like a textbook on hiring practice. But the best thing you'll get out of that is tandem interviews. They teach you some of these aspects as well, but using that the tandem interviews is using a very disciplined way of preparing your questions. They're driving back towards, assessing for alignment, and you're looking for the characteristics that are in your rubric. Right, so you're balancing off between the two of you and asking these questions, and you're not making up questions as you go, and they're not sort of those broad questions that kind of don't really have data that useful data that will result from them. Panel interviews, there may be like 4 of you in the room, and you're going to interview me, right? And there's no preparation in terms of who's going to ask what. There's no real strategy about the data you're collecting. It's just kind of, well, do you like him? Do you like him? Do you like him? Do you like him? Right? So, and then what do you do at the end of the panel? You kind of put your notes back together, maybe, and then you say, up or down, right? So there's.
The panel's okay, it's a tough question.
Well, having multiple people in the room, sort of the group dynamics of that can take away from some of the questions that you want to ask. And sometimes the body language isn't as candid as it is with just a 3 people in a room. So you have to kind of decide how you want to do that. But if you're going to do that, there needs to be a real plan and science behind the questions and the structure of the conversations. And you have to know what do you really want? What's the result? And train your people. We have seen, for the most part, the panel interviews are used as if sort of having a mass evaluation is going to give you more information, and statistically that's not true. So the question is not why not use a panel interview. The question is why use a panel interview, right? I mean, if there's a real reason, if there's a strategic benefit from using it, then by all means use it. We just haven't seen any data to support why doing a panel interview is more accurate than doing a smaller interview with better trained people.
I agree. I mean, I think the only panel or committee is not reflective.
Consensus.
Consensus.
Right. So I would recommend, how many people are on a panel? Okay, so do 2 tandem interviews back to back. You'll get better results that way. And you have to make sure that the 2 are not asking the same questions. So you have to you have to synchronize your questions and what they're looking for. We've done that actually. We've done 2 panels. The first set of questions were more geared towards alignment with mission and culture. The second part was geared towards strategy and the position. Yep. So one is more culture, mission, and the other was so the people doing the second interview were much more tactical. They're looking for the technical skills of the position, right? So they divide up that way, and they can bring their notes back together. Yeah, I'm glad to help. All right. Any other questions? We got lunch planned. Aggie's got a delicious lunch over here, Aggie and Ron, and so out. Guys, thank you so much for letting us be a part of this. Well, I'll be here if you have questions. Otherwise, enjoy lunch or take it, do what you need to do, take it with you. And thank you, Pays Boa, for the opportunity.
We'll get the slides.
Yeah, so they've recorded this as well, so you'll be able to access that, and we'll definitely give you the slides, for sure. And if you want to, Tammy, if you want to send her an email, if you would like to set up the free analysis, we'll be glad to do that as well. All right. Thank you, guys. All right. Yes, ma'am. Ideally, it's November, February, and May. Yeah, February you're doing right before you're doing contracts. And what you're doing in November, you're doing that because you're giving them a chance between the end of the year break to be able to say, I need you to come back with a plan to tell me how things are going to be different to start off the spring semester. So it's a natural break. And then February is because you've now got to make contract decisions. In May, it's a chance for you to check to see what's left. What do we have now? And now what are we doing in the next few months to make sure we have a better team next year than we had this past year? Cool. All right.
Thank you so much. This is
Absolutely.
great. Thank you all for coming, and please, let's have lunch. We're a small enough group. Let's push
Push them
each other
together. Yeah, that's
and we can
awesome.
continue the conversation
Let's
at
do it.
lunch.
Let's do it.